Namaste. Hello, everyone. Thank you to all of you tuned in today. At the onset, I thank the conference and session organizers to give me the opportunity to present before you. The title of my talk is Invoking Nature-Culture Linkages to Strengthen EIA Implementation. In this session, I would be dealing with the concept of natural heritage, at what elements of natural heritage are relevant for wilderness, natural areas, or protected area management and biodiversity conservation. I shall also introduce the idea of intrinsic value of natural heritage with some global examples and case studies. In the end, the discussion on how the nature-culture linkage can strengthen the EIA or HIA implementation will be deliberated. Natural World Heritage Sites are internationally recognized under the World Heritage Convention, that is a unique international legal instrument for the protection of both cultural and natural heritage. In many ways, the relocation of Abu Simbel temples in Egypt from their original site that was fated to get inundated by the high waters of Aswan Dam was the first collective action of multinations as conservation mitigation vis-a-vis a planned development dam in this case in the mid-1960s. Hence, if I may expand the statement to state that an EIA was conducted and a suitable mitigation measure was adopted, possibly the first case in this regard for World Heritage. This collective action of several countries to pitch in with funds, resources, and technology to carry out this massive relocation has been hailed as the precursor to the origin of the World Heritage Convention in 1972. Since then, we have come a long way with over 190 ratifying the treaty and with over 1,100 sites across 167 countries inscribed on the World Heritage List. The World Heritage Convention provides a unique framework for securing the conservation of these exceptional places recognized for being of outstanding universal value to humanity. The most significant feature of this convention is therefore that it links together in a single document the concepts of nature conservation and the preservation of cultural properties. The convention recognizes the way in which people interact with nature and the fundamental need to preserve the balance between the two. World Heritage comprises of cultural and natural sites with many household conservation names such as the Sundarbans, Serengeti, Grand Canyon, and the Great Barrier Reef, which are often a last refuge for threatened species. There are more than 200 natural World Heritage Sites covering over 260 million hectares, which equates to less than 1% of the Earth's surface and over 10% of the planet's protected areas. Broadly, the World Heritage Convention classifies the world heritage of humankind into two categories, cultural heritage and natural heritage, with specific subclassification under the two. For example, cultural heritage comprises of monuments, architectural works, a group of buildings and sites, which are also works of man or combined works of nature and man, and also areas of archaeological sites. Whereas natural heritage comprises of three distinct categories such as natural features, consisting of physical and biological formations, geological and physiographic formations, and areas of habitat of threatened species, of animals, plants of outstanding universal value from the point of view of science and conservation. Clearly, there are categories that have overlap of both the elements and increasingly so as we come with better understanding of sites and its associated linkages to come up with categories of mixed sites and cultural landscape. A World Heritage Site can be defined by its OUV, which is that cultural or natural significance which is so exceptional so as to transcend national boundaries and to be of common importance for present and future generations of all humanity. The term OUV embodies within itself the nature cultural elements and the three pillars that support or help in preserving the OUV, which are the World Heritage Criteria, integrity, authenticity, protection, and management. As indicated previously, there has been an increasing trend towards identifying the nature-culture linkages in sites, thereby strengthening its OUV. Apart from the fact that iconic species and nature area finds manifestation in our culture, beliefs, art, and creativity that also draw a sense of awe and respect from human beings. For example, the sacred mountain peaks of Kanchenjunga, which is India's first mixed World Heritage Site, is a well-established region of high biodiversity in the Himalayan region. But it is also sacred and of reverence to the local Sikkim community, and hence a site with unquestionable attributes that discourage any developmental activities. Similarly, in areas of high human habitation, as in the Sundarbans Transboundary World Heritage of India and Bangladesh, the forest demon and deities have served as a deterrent or reminders of setting aside sacred spaces for fellow living beings. Natural heritage has also inspired and brought about creativity and acknowledgement in recent human memory, hence supporting the idea of biodiversity conservation among the general public. It is well established that human cultural diversity strongly overlaps with the regions of high natural biodiversity and hence can be affected by the same drivers and threats that impact the latter. The recent pandemic is a grim example of how complexities of natural world are so less understood and why must we protect and preserve it at all costs. The World Heritage Convention and its practitioners have therefore played an important role in strengthening the nature-culture connect, and in this case, the most famous example is that of formerly the Uluru Kutha National Park in Australia that has spectacular geographical and geological formations, and it was inscribed as a Natural World Heritage Site in 1987. However, with better understanding of social systems, it was formally recognized for the traditional belief systems that the site holds and therefore reinscribed as a cultural landscape in 1994. The other example is that of Kang Krachan Forest Complex, Thailand, which was deliberated for a possible inscription at the last World Heritage Committee meeting in Baku, where it was noted that the communities residing in and around the protected area and their rights must be addressed, including the implementation of a participatory process to resolve rights and livelihood concerns before the site could be inscribed. This decision in many ways reinstated the need to keep a balance between nature and culture requirements of a site. The other example that I'm most familiar with is Manas Wildlife Sanctuary, where I have served for more than 10 years as a heritage practitioner. Due to its unique geographical location at the junction of three biogeographic realms in Northeast India, it is a site which is rich in ethnic diversity as well as biological diversity, with distinct language, food, and cultural practices. The site is also part of the proposed World Heritage Complex within the Indo-Bhutan landscape, thereby helping in securing one of the largest such inviolate areas for the tiger conservation in this landscape. Manas is a unique case of a World Heritage Site that was inscribed, then placed on the danger list, and subsequently reinstated all within a short span of 19 years. And this expedited turnaround was possible not only because the site's integrity was secured, but also because the site saw several interventions in terms of human development, including the establishment of the first elected local government that led to the revival of the pride and sense of ownership to the place. What was considered as a key threat or driver of destruction was turned table to protect and preserve the site through unique community conservation models, which were timely and apt for areas impacted by recent history of insurgency and disaggregated governance. The other celebrated example is that of the mythological stories that are associated with Mount Kanchenjunga, which also then finally became India's first mixed category World Heritage Site. At the time of nomination, the site was largely a natural site because of its high biological and diverse phytological values. However, at the time of further evaluation, it was realized that several of the elements of nature, such as the sacred caves, rivers, lakes, etc., in the landscape, were also sacred to and of religious, artistic, or cultural significance to the Sikkimese community, thereby ensuring that they had the important nature-culture connect. As we see, therefore, that natural World Heritage sites are largely focused on flagship species protection, but there has been a growing interest in landscape level or community conservation level approach in these protected areas. Therefore, the cultural connect is a potential requirement to be integrated while looking at the protection of the site's OUV. However, the critical challenge also remains towards reviving, revisiting traditional rites and spiritual and cultural values. Middle approach can be to understand and bridge the gap towards World Heritage contributions to local communities, rights, and aspirations. And there is a definite need to understand and build the capacities of the local communities towards the governance and protected area management of the site. As we can see from the preceding slides, many of the unique places, especially natural sites in developing nations, are increasingly faced with threats such as mining, infrastructure projects, poaching, illegal logging, agricultural encroachment, and climate change. According to the IUCN, the advisory body to UNESCO on World Heritage Matters, it has reported that around 222 natural World Heritage sites, which is nearly 8% of the sites, are in the list of World Heritage Site in danger. 25% of these are affected by serious conservation issues, with many more likely to be impacted with anthropogenic threats. Many sites have been indirectly impacted by development processes elsewhere, particularly outside the World Heritage, but in the vicinity of the site, and therefore being better empirical tools are needed to develop and examine and evaluate such impacts. In 2011, International Council on Monuments and Sites, ICOMOS, came up with the HIA, or the Heritage Impact Assessment, which is a tool to identify threats to effects of a current or proposed development policy or action on the cultural aspects of the site. And therefore, it was important to look at the planning and decision-making process, in particular with a view to mitigate the adverse impacts. It's important, therefore, that the right answers are sought at every stage of the planning process of the HIA, for which a step-by-step guidance note has been prepared and would be useful to revisit. It is important to consider whether all proposals that may adversely affect a natural World Heritage site are located within or outside its boundaries, that experts with World Heritage protected area and biodiversity knowledge must be closely involved in the assessment process from the beginning, that the environmental and social impacts of the development proposal on the site's OUV must be assessed, including the direct, indirect, and cumulative effects. And reasonable alternatives to the proposal must be identified and assessed with the aim of recommending the most sustainable option to decision makers. Mitigation measures should be identified in line with the priority ranking, with first avoiding potential negative impacts and secondly reducing unavoidable residual impacts through mitigation measures, and that the environmental management plan must be proposed, implemented, and independently audited. I therefore also propose that seeking specific stakeholder responses to their belongingness to the site is important, and the right tools for building capacities to analyze the same must be included. To conclude, Preserving the OUV of the site must be key to all the HIA assessments undertaken for heritage sites, infrastructure, and other development proposals or concessions located within or outside the boundaries of a natural World Heritage Site should be considered in terms of whether they are compatible with the long-term objective of preserving the OUV of the site for future generations. The assessment should also consider the site's linkages, especially the ecological and cultural connectivity with the surrounding landscape, as a natural World Heritage Site cannot be considered separately from the wider ecosystems. And understanding the natural connect in the cultural value of the site, be it in terms of sacred spiritual value of the place or in terms of sense of place, it is important that communities living in and around the sites are suitably informed with developed capacities to come up with a discussion. Further, HIA and EIA are increasingly required to analyze possible effects and consequences of development on OUV of World Heritage properties. Therefore, key stakeholders, including local community and developers involved in the implementation of the World Heritage Convention and the monitoring of sites, must be empowered with the governance framework and methodological tools and guidelines to carry out effective impact assessments. The COVID-19 pandemic has reminded us that our own health is inextricably linked to the health of ecosystems, and it is very important that we consider nature and nature connect in every aspect of human well-being to ensure our own survival. Thank you so much, and good day and goodbye.
Hello, my name is Charles Kelly. I'm going to speak about how COVID-19 is changing impact assessment. My own background is that I'm a disaster management consultant, and I've had decades of work principally outside the United States on disaster risk management. I have worked on epidemics, but not as yet a pandemic. So this, like for many other people, is new experience for me. Over the last 20 years, I focused a lot on disasters and the environment and how those two things interface, and trying to work towards incorporating environmental considerations into disaster response, and particularly humanitarian response. That's to say the assistance that takes place between one country and another. What we'll cover in this presentation includes a brief look at the pandemic. We'll talk about some of the results of an IAI survey on how the pandemic has affected impact assessment. And then I'll give a brief perspective on the way things look as we move forward through the pandemic and its impacts on impact assessment. Well, the pandemic, at the time this presentation was developed, it looks like there are about 32 million confirmed cases globally, and unfortunately, close to 1 million fatalities as well. These numbers are likely to be underreported, so the impact of the pandemic may be much greater than these statistics indicate. Now, the response itself is something that's been done for 600 years, and is essentially to keep the sick away from those who are not sick. Now, this process created a rapid imposition of physical distancing, and that abruptly changed how we work, how we socialize, and how we manage the functions of daily life. Now, impact assessment itself involves, among other things, the collection of field samples, the going to the field to collect data, to collect soil samples and other things like that, and then also contact with the affected populations. And these contacts are for various purposes and for various durations. So for instance, a survey may be done taking 5 minutes with people asking them their views on certain aspects. Or there may be a week-long workshop with a variety of communities talking about the impact of a proposed project or plan. And certainly at the end of the process of impact assessment, there's a need for meetings with the affected populations to explain to them the results of the impact assessment. Now, the efforts to stop COVID-19 disrupted these core elements of the impact assessment work. But COVID-19 also impacted the personal lives, the staying at home for what is essentially a traveling profession. whether it's people traveling 20 kilometers a day to collect water samples from a river, or people traveling halfway around the world to guide the process for developing an impact assessment for a major infrastructure project. So one of the characteristics of impact assessment is essentially that those who do it travel a lot, whether they be short distances or long. And that's something that the efforts to control COVID-19 have significantly disrupted. Now, I am interested in how the pandemic was affecting the process of impact assessment, the work that's being done or was not being done because of the control measures, but also the people who were involved in this work as professionals. There were 2 rounds of surveys, one in May and the second in July and August of this year. The first survey had about 900 respondents and the second survey about 700. Details on these surveys are available from the web links that I've provided on the slide here. And I do encourage you to go see the fuller details of those 2 surveys. What I'm providing today is a snapshot of the second survey, and that will lead us into some comments about the way things may happen in the future. So we asked the respondents in the second survey, which of the following situations best match their current situation. So luckily, very few of the respondents were actually in hospital or medical facilities, but a significant number were either staying at home because they had been quarantined, because they were making that decision themselves to stay at home, or because of official government requirements to stay home. At the same time, a good number of respondents were also working as normal, but with limitations on the time in the office or on travel. So we can see from this chart here that COVID-19 did have a significant impact on the respondents to the second survey. So we asked the respondents how had COVID-19 most affected their work. So we had some cases, relatively few, luckily, where respondents had received stop work orders, or their businesses had closed, or they'd had to stop work. For the rest, it's clear that impact assessment work continued despite the restrictions imposed by the COVID-19 control measures, whether it be to a reduction in travel and in-person meetings, or working from home, or redesigning work. In a few cases, the COVID-19 restrictions of the pandemic had not affected or no longer affected people's work. And it's a small number, but still we have to recognize that some people were able to work despite the pandemic. Now, turning to travel restrictions and how they affected the survey respondents' work, we do see that close to 40% of the respondents indicated that they continued to work as before, but now worked remotely. And this is a theme that we find throughout the surveys, both surveys, is a shift from a more in-the-field effort, whether it be collecting data or talking to populations or doing other things in the field, to working remotely. Now, there was, at the time of this second survey, about 16% who had already returned to work under what seemed to be pre-normal, pre-pandemic conditions. And so that's a trend that we would expect to see over time as the conditions change and people become more able to get back to what would be similar to their normal way of working. Now, we recognize with people working remotely, there's a need to develop methods to address the challenges of communicating with populations. Now, what we find from the survey is that 50% indicated they're not doing anything new or different. There were some interesting things that were attempted, such as engaging local organizations to collect information, promoting citizen science, or training communities to collect data in the place of traveling to locations to collect data. As you will note, drones, some people were using them, but not very many. But this is interesting that 50% of the respondents indicated they were not doing anything new or different, even though fieldwork and contact with populations that are affected by development is one of the core elements of impact assessment. Now, when we look at the techniques or technology used for consultations and meetings and hearings and everything like that, what we do find is a very heavy reliance on software and a digital framework. So video conferencing, soliciting comments over the online or through emails, using online surveys, gathering input via social media. There were still efforts reported to continue to hold live consultations, but they're relatively small compared to the overall responses that we saw. And the idea of hiring local individuals to conduct surveys or hold meetings was something that was mentioned only by a few of the respondents. Now, when we turn to the impact of the pandemic on the individuals who responded, what we find here is that there's a lot of what we call stressors about the situation. This is normal for a disaster or for a crisis where the situation that triggered it, whether it be a landslide or a hurricane, a cyclone, a flood, an earthquake, creates uncertainty about the future. However, in this case, we're looking at a crisis or a disaster that's gone on for at least 6 months so far and may continue for another 6 months in the same kind of uncertainty. And so these stressors and these indications of stress are very important to recognize that the people who are engaged in impact assessment and the people who responded to the survey were experiencing situations which are not positive about how they live their lives. Now, in contrast, we have to recognize that the pandemic did come up with positive impacts. The most 54% of the respondents indicated they had more time to spend with their families, spent less money because they were traveling less, that they recognized positive impacts on the environment and other kinds of improvements to the environment. But what we have to recognize here, this is not a balanced scale kind of situation. So somebody who's spending less time with their family because of the way they have to work under the conditions imposed by COVID-19 may not be able to address that issue by having less time to commute. So we have to recognize that there are positive and negative impacts, but also be cognizant of the fact that these positive impacts may occur to different people than the negative stressors that we saw in the previous slide. So now we turn to looking at the role of impact assessment moving forward, and particularly how COVID-19 may change that. So what we found is 30% of the respondents expected a temporary relaxation of environmental impact assessments or impact assessments in general as part of the stimulation of the economy. At the same time, almost 30% thought that impact assessment would become more important going forward to ensure that projects as part of the recovery process from the pandemic would be effective and not have negative impacts. 23% felt there were no change, but interesting, 18% felt that COVID-19 would be used to permanently dilute the rules and regulations related to impact assessment. And this is a significant issue because of some of the questions raised about the utility of impact assessments and particularly the time and effort needed to complete impact assessments in a normal situation. And when we look at that from another perspective, the respondents indicated, 56% of the respondents indicated that where they were operating, the government had taken no action or was not proposing to take actions to change environmental rules and regulations in response to the pandemic. However, at the same time, a significant number of participants in the survey also indicated that either the government had made changes, was proposing changes, or had made changes, and they were hung up in the legal system and hadn't yet been implemented. So here we have a picture of a good number of the respondents not expecting that changes or not seeing changes being made in environmental rules and regulations, but still a large number, almost equal number of respondents indicating that some efforts have been made by governments where they were located to change the environmental rules and regulations based on the pandemic. Turning to some preliminary conclusions based on the survey work that IAI has done. COVID-related physical distancing will continue to disrupt the field and travel-focused nature of the profession. These impacts will be frequent and unpredictable. Conditions will change so that what might have been an area where field data can be collected will be considered off bounds or a hotspot for COVID over 2 or 3 days. A result will be that impact assessment work needs to be very flexible and adaptable to continuing changes in the rules and regulations about how you go into the field and where you can go once you're in the field. Now, this requires consideration changing the timelines for impact assessments, but also the methods used in impact assessment and the costs of performing impact assessment. The profession has developed workarounds for many of the challenges created by the COVID-19 situation, but the reliance on electronic communications for stakeholder consultations may be excluding those on the other side of the digital divide. This has significant downstream implications. In many cases, impact assessment, and particularly environmental impact assessment procedures, are set out in rules and regulations about what needs to be done, in what order, in what time, and under what procedures. If it turns out that because of the inability of impact assessment professionals to get to the affected communities and have conversations and meetings and collect data from them, this may then become an issue that raises questions about how effective and how accurate are the impact assessment results. These questions can then become the basis for even legal challenges to impact assessments and then require the whole process to start over again at significant delay to implementing projects and also significant additional costs to the people paying for the impact assessment. This is not so much a prediction as a raising of concern that we have well-established procedures for impact assessment, and particularly for environmental impact assessment, social impact assessments, and health impact assessments, but that the COVID-19 situation and the physical restrictions imposed by that situation may require changing how those procedures need to be implemented. The impact assessment is expected to provide a useful role in the pandemic recovery, according to the people who responded to the surveys. But, and very significantly, there is uncertainty as to whether the pandemic will be used to bypass normal impact assessment requirements in an effort to quickly implement recovery projects without what is seen to be a burdensome process of impact assessment. The danger here is twofold. First, that recovery projects will be implemented quickly without a proper screening through the impact assessment process and result in downstream negative impacts, possibly significant downstream negative impacts. The second is that any changes to impact assessment rules and regulations triggered by the pandemic may risk becoming permanent and therefore significantly reducing the value of impact assessment in the whole development process. The pandemic has clearly led to some benefits to the survey participants. But we also need to be aware that the survey provided evidence of considerable pandemic-associated stress. This is a matter of concern. This pandemic has been going on for at least 6 months and may continue in a similar fashion for the next 6 months. The levels of stress that accumulate over time in this extended disaster are points that need to be considered both in how impact assessment is provided, how people who are involved in an impact assessment work, and how the general population responds to the demands of a continuing crisis. These are points that need to be considered as we move forward in anticipating how impact assessment will need to change during this current pandemic crisis. Thank you very much. I hope this has been a useful presentation on how COVID-19 is changing impact assessment. I encourage you to look at the 2 survey reports and the web links for those at the bottom of the screen. Please feel free to pose questions or comments in the discussion board associated with this presentation, and I will reply as soon as possible. I'd like to thank you again and hope that you have a safe and productive future as we move forward in this pandemic. Thank you very much.
Hello everyone, and welcome to our presentation on Passing the Baton, Developing E&S Skills for Early Career Professionals, and thank you for joining us. My name is Gemma Holdsworth. I'm an environmental consultant with 5 years experience in environmental and social due diligence. I'm monitoring with experience covering the UK and abroad, including geographies in Ethiopia, Ivory Coast, Serbia, Turkey and beyond.
Hi everyone, my name's Pete Gabriel and I'm a senior environmental consultant at Arup. I have over 10 years experience in the environment sector, specialising in the management, development and coordination of environmental social due diligences and environmental social impact assessments. Worked on many different projects in energy, infrastructure and climate resilience, and I've been lucky enough to work all over the world. Presently I'm working in Africa and Eastern Europe. So we work for Arup, and Arup's mission is to shape a better world. We're recognised as industry leaders in environmental and social consulting, and we're also members of the United Nations Global Compact. The great thing about Arup is that we're not confined by geography. We collaborate with teams all over the world, and we help our clients to achieve their sustainability goals. So what is it? What is our presentation about? So this is just to summarize the context. So this presentation is really designed for anyone who is involved in the international finance sector from an environmental and social perspective. And the session is focused both at early career professionals, we'll refer to them as ECPs hereafter, looking to develop themselves within the industry, is also for experienced professionals interested in understanding what support they can provide to ECPs that they may work with to help them develop their careers. The session will aim to reflect on the skills and knowledge we should be teaching to the next generation of ECPs. It's designed to be a short taster session to the original full presentation we had planned to deliver next year at the IAIA conference in Seville. So the session will outline some of the work we've already done to help support ECPs in this space, what barriers and opportunities there are in this space for ECPs. We'll then go on to identify potential key future themes that ECPs should be considering when developing their skills and knowledge. And we will also reflect on potential methods to ensure resilience for learning and development of ECPs.
Thanks, Pete. So to give just some context to how we got here, we're working with the IEMA, which is the Institute of Environmental and Management and Assessment, and that's a professional body working for everyone in environment and sustainability, from your early career to the top. And they provide a lot of support to ECPs and professionals alike in terms of training resources, conferences and events. And we're specifically part of the IEMA GISA group, which was set up to engage international finance experts. So GISA stands for Global Environmental and Social Assessment. It was originally a steering group consisting of experienced professionals from the international finance industry, and then it broadened to include an early careers working group, which is what Pete and I are part of, which was specifically designed to engage and identify activities that can support ECPs in the international finance industry. Next slide, please, Pete. So one of the first tasks that we did as an ECP working group was we looked at the opportunities and barriers for ECPs in the international finance industry. And I'm going to start by talking through the barriers. So on the slide here, we have all the different themes that we covered. I'm just going to pick up on some of the key points. So lack of awareness and visibility in terms of the opportunities that are available in the international finance industry was an issue that a lot of our ECPs commented on. So often these teams in our organizations we found tend to be quite top heavy, and the opportunities to get involved with these projects are limited because we don't exactly know the skills and experience that we need to get there. And this means that it's quite difficult for us to get onto bids and opportunities for these projects because we don't have the particular skill set and experience needed. And the international finance industry is complex, and there are lots of different issues to consider and a very specific type of approach to managing risks and knowledge that's required, and that people weren't getting engaged early enough in developing those skills, which made it difficult then to transition. We also found that there wasn't a clear career pathway set out for ECPs to get involved in these sorts of projects, as we noticed with the UK EIA work more traditionally. So we, as part of our group, wanted to look at opportunities of how we could involve ECPs in these and overcome these barriers. Thank you.
Yeah, so whilst we should acknowledge and understand these potential barriers, it's also important to reflect on potential opportunities for ECPs in our sector. Why should our sector invest time and resources in training and developing ECPs? Well, the first point we have here is about perspective. So ECPs bring a fresh perspective to the challenges facing our industry, and indeed the key challenges with environmental and social sustainability over the next few decades. We need ECPs to contribute novel ideas, to think outside the box, come up with creative solutions to these problems. Just think about the recent youth climate change protests, key example of just how powerful younger generations' voices can be. Innovation. ECPs are perhaps less stuck in their ways and potentially more open to new ideas. For example, the ECPs may have developed skills in a digital world and are more comfortable with new technology. I'll come on to talk about this a bit later. So ECPs can provide innovative solutions to complex problems. Adaptability. ECPs may be more flexible in the types of work they choose to take on. They may also be flexible in where they're located in the world. We need ECPs who can be adaptable, learn quickly in an ever-changing global environment. Gaps in the market. So our sector is growing. There's increased awareness of E&S responsibility across governments, business, and society. ECPs will play a key role in helping to drive this momentum forward over the next few decades. So ultimately, we need ECPs to become the next generation of E&S professionals to continue the good work that has been done to date and to help secure a more sustainable world for future generations. And I'm personally very excited about where our sector is heading in the next few decades. So what can we do to educate and attract ECPs into our industry? So this slide helps to explore some of the key tools and methods that can be used to ensure ECPs get access to the skills and knowledge they need to be successful. So the timeline here represents the different stages in an individual's career, from the tail end of academia all the way through to a bit later on. So clearly from this slide, you can see that you never really stop learning throughout your career. But whilst you're at the ECP stage, that's the second from the left stage, you perhaps have the most opportunity, tools and resources at your disposal to learn and develop as a professional. So obviously academic and professional qualifications are important. Many ECPs take on university degrees that are tailored to working in international development, international finance, economics, E&S disciplines. This is incredibly useful to develop these skills and knowledge. In our team at Arup, we often look for grads with specific qualifications as they most closely align with the skills and knowledge we require to deliver to our clients. But professional qualifications are also important. So joining a graduate development scheme, charterships, other relevant training are all available that can be undertaken at the earlier stages of your career. The next one down is mentors. So we feel it's really important for ECPs to be able to access a network of mentors for learning and support. And this can be both within and outside of your organization. We would recommend getting a mentor both within and outside of your organization. Maybe you can use an external network to get one that is outside of your organization. And mentors can often offer on-the-job training, perhaps exposure to some of their projects, and can overall be useful learning partners. Professional experience and skills is arguably the most important of these in this list. Getting on-the-job professional experience allows exposure to clients, projects, different ways of working, different environments, cultures, and we should not underestimate the value of getting ECPs on the job experience of site survey work or shadowing an expert to help them develop a report. CPD, so obviously ongoing training and development throughout your career is important. Attendances at conferences, webinars such as the one we're currently doing, and also overall engagement with a professional network is really important to upskill yourself. But ultimately, it's up to the individual ECPs to drive their own growth, forge their own path. However, with a framework in place and access to the tools and support they need, this can be much easier for them. That's the next slide, Gemma.
So to pick up on what Pete was saying about academia, it's obviously an important early stage. And as the quote on the slide here says, finding and retaining talented and motivated individuals is one of the biggest challenges faced by companies, team leaders and industries like international finance. In the past, there was an assumption that new talent could potentially be easily accessed by hiring people straight out of university and then providing them with a job for life. But the market has changed. Graduates are not really coming out of university expecting that, and employees aren't necessarily offering that anymore. There's a lot more jumping between companies and significant career changes. So how do we keep these talented individuals that we need to sustain the international finance industry interested and motivated? And we think that engaging them at an early stage and having strong links with academia is extremely important to do this. Some examples of how we go about this. So delivering talks to students. Companies go into universities to give more information about what is involved in the industry and what type of skills and opportunities that they are. Offering mentoring opportunities, as Pete picked up on. Engaging students via institutions such as IA and IEMA. And IEMA in particular has been successful with this in the past with the JUICA ECP group. We put on a free event for 2 years in a row now in September, which includes students and other ECPs in the industry to come along and find out more about the industry, do some case study work and really understand what's involved. And that's actually been incredibly successful and has resulted in some students now being embedded in those organizations. So it really shows the benefit of doing that engagement early on. Sponsoring and collaborating on student dissertation and research projects. This brings benefits both ways. It not only brings students interested in your organization, but also offers your organization access to the most up-to-date research in the field, which is extremely valuable. So whilst all these suggestions we've talked about before, I would ask, as if individuals in our own company, are we doing enough to engage people at an early enough stage? And once I would really encourage you that when you get ECPs in your organization, create an environment where they can maintain their links that they have with universities and encourage their students in the year below to come and work with us because we need them to deal with the challenges that our industry is facing. Thank you. Next slide.
Okay, so this slide is about encouraging innovation. How can we encourage ECPs to break away from the norms and bring innovation to the ways we all work? We need to act fast to solve many of the world's current issues, and we should be listening to ECPs' ideas and encourage them to drive forward innovation in their work. So the first point here, the first theme really is about technology. So in some cases, ECPs may be better able to utilize technology to their advantages in their work. We've seen a lot of technological advances over the last few decades. For example, the use of so-called big data to extrapolate macro trends, model predictions, and automate ENS assessments. We have satellite technology and drones now. We've only really started to scratch the surface of how useful drones can be for field surveys and communicating with remote communities. We have augmented reality, virtual reality. This kind of technology is already being used on sites, but it will only continue to be used in the future. And ECPs I see as a key driver of those new technologies. Improving efficiency, so really back to what I was saying before, but challenging the norm. ECPs will be key to challenging the old ways of working to improve efficiency and deliver key outcomes. So we're already seeing in our industry the use of digital reports, online reporting, scaled back reporting. And ECPs can also be key to challenging the fundamental assessment methods that we are using and stopping us in our tracks and asking, is this method still working? Is there a way we could do this better? Changing worlds, so ECPs will be key to be able to think of ways to solve some of the world's key challenges. I mean, obviously the challenges that we are facing are huge. We have climate change, biodiversity, not to mention COVID-19, human rights, racial inequality, gender equality. The list just goes on. And we feel that ECPs will be absolutely key to considering and incorporating solutions to these big issues in their work over the next few decades. So let's give them a voice and a platform to do this. And communication is absolutely key as well. So we've seen in the post-COVID-19 world, we've all had to quickly learn to adopt smarter networking and communication strategies. And ECPs are already well placed to adapt quickly to this movement and use it to advance our sector in the future.
Thank you, Pete. Yeah, so to pick on those points that Pete was making, young people are more connected than ever via technology. For example, a recent survey showed that 53% of youngsters owned a mobile phone by around the age of 7, and that by age 11, 90% had their own device. And these are the environmental and social professionals of the future, and we need to accommodate for that. As Pete said, COVID-19 arrived and we were forced to adopt new technologies at a rapid speed in the workplace, as well as in our normal lives. And in the face of more restrictions, we'll have to continue to adapt. And we really want to help to support ECPs in that process, but also it's important to create an open and inclusive environment where ECPs feel comfortable putting their concerns forward about the way we work and asking the question, can we do it better and how can we? Such as the ARUP Virtual Engage tool, which offers the opportunity to join a stakeholder engagement event from wherever you are in the world and to engage with professionals and to look at materials without having to attend an in-person event. These kind of ideas are the ideas that we need to keep driving the industry forward. But also we need to think about what additional support might ECPs need given the context of how they've grown up and their relationship with technology. So face-to-face networking and stakeholder engagement is still going to be extremely valuable. I know we can't do it now, but I think we will get there. And it might be that from their generation, they're not as well versed in those kind of communication techniques that might be our bread and butter because they come from a different context. So it's worth considering whether ECPs will need additional support in developing those sort of unique negotiation and communication skills. And also thinking about the workplace. So a lot of graduates now will be joining new jobs and not even entering an office. They'll join it completely virtually. So thinking about how you make sure that they get the support and guidance that they need as new starters to the company without being in an office environment is another important consideration. This is obviously a really fast-moving field and will continue to develop, but we would really encourage all of us to develop new and flexible ways of working and get a really good dialogue between the experienced professionals and the ECPs to find the best ways of working. Thank you. Next slide.
So in summary, to conclude our presentation, it's really important that we engage ECPs at an early stage in their career. Traditionally, there's been a more of a transitional approach into our sector, which inevitably makes our industry top heavy. So we need to bring ECPs in early, we need to educate them, and we need to encourage them to innovate. To address these huge challenges that are facing the world, it's key that we engage and support ECPs in their progression effectively. We need to create open learning and knowledge sharing environments for ECPs as well as experienced professionals. And we need to achieve a balance between well-established ways of working and new ways of working. So we want to ensure that we innovate, but we don't innovate for the sake of innovation. So that, go on, Gemma.
I was going to say, thank you so much for listening. Please use the discussion boards along with our presentation. And if you have any particular questions, our email addresses are here and our ARUP website as well. We've also added the link for the IEMA GISA Early Careers Working Group on LinkedIn, where we share materials and resources and updates on events. And also the link below, you can find out more about the IEMA GISA Steering Group's objectives and how you can get involved.
Thank you all very much for listening.
Hi, I'm Mark Cliffe-Phillips. I'm the Executive Director with the Mackenzie Valley Environmental Impact Review Board. I'm humbled and honored to be asked to speak to you today as one of the many speakers delivering interesting and topical presentations on key issues facing impact assessment around the world at today's IAIA 20 Virtual Symposium. I'll share a story about our board's experiences with assessing impacts to well-being and way of life of Indigenous peoples in the Mackenzie Valley. I'd first like to acknowledge that I'm presenting from beautiful Yellowknife in the Northwest Territories in Northern Canada, which is located in Chief Dragi's territory of the Yellowknives Dene First Nation, which is within the Acacia Treaty 8 territory. I'd also like to recognize the Métis of the North Slave Métis Alliance and the NWT Métis Nation. I'll first provide an overview of the legal and cultural context of where we work. I'll briefly outline our approach to well-being assessment and how and when Indigenous traditional knowledge is considered in our impact assessment processes when considering well-being, and provide some examples of Indigenous well-being assessments in recent EAs, as well as some forward-looking approaches our board is looking to implement. Here's a map of where we are situated within Northern Canada. We're north of the 60th parallel and extend up to the high Arctic, almost to the North Pole. The Mackenzie Valley is the southern part of the territory and is approximately 1 million square kilometers in size. Just to give some context, that's the size of Egypt or Bolivia, or twice as the size of Spain. But we have less than 40,000 people, which is a mix of about 50% Indigenous and 50% non-Indigenous people. The resource management system in the Mackenzie Valley is based on the 3 modern comprehensive land claim agreements in our region. From the land claim agreements, we get 2 fundamental principles as outlined in Mackenzie Valley Resource Management Act that subsequently followed the land claims. These 2 principles are co-management and an integrated and coordinated resource management system that includes the regulation of land and water and wildlife, land use planning, and project assessment. The review board is a co-management board where half of the board's members are nominated by Indigenous land claimant organizations or governments, and the other half are members that are nominated by the federal and territorial governments. The board are responsible for conducting environmental impact assessments in the Mackenzie Valley. The board is also required to take a broad approach to assessing impacts to the environment that is holistic in nature and is based on the definition of the environment in our Act, where an impact to the environment is any effect on the land, water, air, or any other component of the environment, as well as on wildlife harvesting, and includes any effect on the social and cultural environment or on heritage resources. All of this needs to be considered in an integrated fashion. So why well-being? A primary consideration for our board is to assess impacts to people of the Mackenzie Valley. The mandate is to consider the importance of the conservation to the well-being of way of life of Aboriginal people as defined under the Act and the Constitution of the Mackenzie Valley. And we also need to protect the social, cultural, and economic well-being of all residents of the Mackenzie Valley as a whole. Centering impact assessment on well-being is a meaningful and more inclusive way to assess both project and cumulative effects because it is a better reflection of the way the world actually works. Rather than considering how a project interacts with isolated and discrete parts of the environment, a focus on well-being considers how a project interacts with the intricately connected parts of the environment, including individuals and communities, in a mutually dependent system. Due to the composition of the board and the communities of the Mackenzie Valley, the board considers different contexts, values, and views when assessing projects, and to consider the conservation of well-being and way of life of Indigenous people, the board must meaningfully consider Indigenous knowledge as a key source of evidence within its process. The board has had guidelines to assist parties and the developers on how they expect Indigenous traditional knowledge to be incorporated throughout our process. Probably one of the first guidelines of its type in the world. These guidelines include advice to developers on how to build relationships, to EIA participants on how to share Indigenous traditional knowledge, and also details about confidentiality and ownership of that knowledge. TK consists of large sets of observations of the environment over a substantial time period that could add an important perspective and understanding of variability of the biophysical, social, and cultural environment. TK holders can often identify links between seemingly unrelated components of the environment. There's various ways for TK to enter our EA process. There's direct communication between the knowledge holders themselves and the review board through community scoping sessions when we're setting out the terms of reference of the EA and the scope of the assessment, and during public hearings. There's also the formal traditional knowledge studies that we often receive. There's communication between traditional knowledge holders and the developers. We ask the developer to work collaboratively with those potentially affected Indigenous groups to better design their project to minimize impacts on cultural well-being and way of life. For that to occur, and for them to consider that in their project design and mitigation design, there needs to be early and often community engagement. There also needs to be a consideration of the context of the land use and culture of that particular area that the project is located within. So how have we considered well-being in recent EAs? The Mackenzie Valley Review Board has a strong track record of making EA decisions that protect the cultural values and consider traditional knowledge at the same level of evidence as Western science. The review board has had a few projects that they've assessed that, although they were small in scale and scope and unlikely to result in likely significant impacts to the biophysical environment, they were rejected due to the likely impact to the cultural and spiritual values placed upon the area by the local Indigenous people. Ultimately, some projects are incompatible with the values held for the land. Some other case studies that I want to share is a recent assessment of the Clecho All-Season Highway that looked at a proposed link to a community that has traditionally only had access by waterway or by ice road for a few weeks of the year in the winter. Among several measures that came with the approval of the project, the territorial government, who is the proponent in this case, will need to provide resourcing and support to the local Indigenous governments to monitor and adaptively manage impacts on the health and well-being of the community, which relies heavily on traditional harvesting and on cultural practices in the project area. Another project was the Fortune Minerals NICO project, which is a cobalt, bismuth, and gold mine that's quite near the terminus of the highway that I just spoke about. This was an assessment of a mine that was in the middle of a culturally significant area where there was a risk that the project might limit the ability of intergenerational Indigenous knowledge transfer. This resulted in a measure for the developer to support the development of a cultural knowledge camp and the development of an aquatic effects monitoring program that was led by the community that incorporated both Indigenous knowledge and Western scientific practices. Here's myself in the middle of this picture with some other scientists supporting and training some of the community-based monitors. But in reality, scientists ended up relying heavily on the knowledge of the elders. And this benefit not just this program, but also the parallel aquatic effects monitoring program that was a requirement of the regulatory approvals for the mine. Another case study was a recent environmental assessment of the Dominion Diamonds J project. This EA looked at the creation of a new pit and extension of the mine life by over 20 years. That resulted in an extension. So that this pit was also in a culturally significant lake and would require the construction of a large ring dike and the draining of a large portion of the water body. A road also needed to be built across an esker that was a major migratory route for an already threatened caribou herd. In one particularly important cultural area near the new pit, there was a waterway called the Narrows. This was a place where many different Indigenous groups used for traditional harvesting and cultural use. The developer focused their assessment on water levels that would be safe for fish. But traditional knowledge holders describe the importance of the area for caribou to cross, and that water levels may be lowered to still be safe for fish, but might end up creating hazards for caribou who might get impeded by rocks that they could usually swim over rather than walk across. This is an example of where the knowledge sets are mutually complementary to better design mitigation that works for all parties and different aspects of the environment. Another measure that resulted from this project was the creation of an Elders Advisory Group. And this Elders Advisory Group was intended to provide advice on designing mitigation to limit the impacts to caribou, from things like developing caribou crossings, where those would happen, and also when the road should be closed or limited to access due to the proximity of caribou during its migratory period. This Elders Advisory Group also helped design the esker crossing that better facilitated the migration of caribou across the road. The government also needed to work with directly affected Indigenous communities to develop a community-based well-being monitoring and adaptive management program. This was to limit social well-being impacts in the future. The last case study that I wanted to describe is a recent environmental assessment of the Diavik diamond mine. This was an example of an assessment of a closure option for the Diavik mine, where the developer proposed to store mine tailings in the base of the pit and underground workings and cover it with a large freshwater cap at closure. This would create a chemical gradient that would isolate the tailings at the base of the pit through a process called meramixis. The retaining dike would be breached at closure, and the lake would be reconnected to the pit once the water reached its water closure objectives and criteria. The developer focused on meeting technical water quality criteria and objectives that were protective of the aquatic life, but they didn't spend much time looking at the impacts to cultural use and well-being, thinking that if aquatic life was okay, then those impacts wouldn't occur. This wasn't the view that local Indigenous communities took. This resulted in many follow-up requirements that focused on minimizing impacts to cultural well-being and cultural use of the area. Diavik will work collaboratively with Indigenous groups to develop criteria, water quality criteria, for determining if the pit lakes is acceptable for the water in the pit lakes is acceptable for cultural use. Diavik must also meet water quality in the pits that meet these criteria through modeling and monitoring before they deposit more waste into the tailings into the pits. In addition, Diavik will establish an independent review panel for water quality modeling, improved and additional engagement with communities to be better informed when they're designing future mitigation. And GNWT, the government, must work and support communities to develop cultural well-being indicators and fund and support community-led monitoring programs that would also benefit future environmental assessments in this area. We've noticed that developers have been challenged to meaningfully conduct cultural impact assessment that considers Indigenous well-being and way of life. We realize without better guidance, the board at the current time might be better placed to independently conduct this component of the assessment within our process through assessing cultural impacts through workshops and sessions in the communities. And to do good cultural impact assessment, it's necessary to hear directly from the people who are potentially going to be impacted by a development, particularly those with traditional or local knowledge. We've hosted community cultural impact sessions to help give an opportunity to fulfill our board's mandate in a way that's meaningful to people most directly affected by a project. Focusing on culture and Indigenous traditional knowledge and taking the time to work with communities can empower people to actively participate in identifying solutions to cultural, social, and other environmental impact concerns. It's also important to have people that can help interpret that knowledge that is being shared. And we've hired local knowledge interpreters to facilitate and help report on the outcomes of these sessions. We've realized that most of our staff are not Indigenous and have trouble sometimes understanding or interpreting the information that they hear. We've had the benefit of having board members that do understand this, but having our technical staff as well as other parties to our process have this reporting is being helpful and can be used in evidence in the submissions of those parties' interventions. We also need to make sure that the process is culturally appropriate, and we need to think outside the box when designing how, when, and where to engage with communities. Sometimes we need to go to the people and where people are not inside, not in a gym, not in a boardroom. We need to go and create venues that allow for people to want to share that information. The board is also drafting a new framework on how to better consider impacts on well-being and way of life of Indigenous people in its impact assessments. This systematic approach to assessing well-being needs to reflect the different context in which people experience impacts and the different value systems within the Mackenzie Valley. We need to define and track impacts against community-driven indicators of well-being, go beyond the more siloed approaches to socioeconomic and cultural impact assessment to consider communities' visions of their own well-being and whether a proposed project contributes or hinders that vision. And we need to incorporate sustainability to seriously consider all aspects of well-being for current and future generations. In the meantime, parties and developers have relied on our current socioeconomic impact assessment guidelines that are still very comprehensive and relevant and quite robust and give lots of guidance on how to conduct socioeconomic and cultural impact assessment. I'll end on a quote from a past Yellowknives Dene chief, Chief Daryl Bolio, who reminded our board in a hearing that the board is here because our cultures and histories are intertwined with yours, and the decisions you make will either diminish us as a people or else enable us to protect what's basic to our identity and our culture and our values. With that, I'd like to say thank you, merci, cho, and thank you in all of our Indigenous languages in the Northwest Territories. For more information, you could look at our website, reviewboard.ca, and you could also find our contact information there. Thank you.